For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. David of Nebula. David lived in a city of clouds. You might be picturing a rainy day as you read this, with clouds gathering in gray billows and then bursting into tears. In fact, there was no rain in David's town, which was called Nebula, though sometimes the clouds descended low and swathed the earth in a damp mist. These clouds were different than anything you've seen. They were so thick that they sometimes clung to your clothes like strings of cotton. Occasionally the clouds touched the ground, but usually they rested just a few inches above the tallest citizens' heads. If you pressed your hand into the clouds, a handprint would stay for a moment. They were soft to the touch. Some said they were God's beard. David had no idea of what kind of God would wear such a beard, nor why this God would stay in one place for so long. One man, the oldest in the city, had seen Nebula without clouds. Indeed, every century the clouds lifted for one unpredictable day. There were books, but only a few, on what the city looked like without clouds. Most of them were short, and a few were only a paragraph. One had a single word and nothing more. Incredible! The old man, Professor Jake, had written the lengthiest of the books. In it, he said that the unclouded sky was pink as strawberry meat. He said that there were huge rocks in the distance, with big plants, trees, he called them, of many colors. Corn yellow, gold, rust, and blood red. Nebula had some grasses and ferns, some vegetable vines and corn stalks, but nothing like what the old man described. Its roads, paths, and houses were made of small rocks and mortared pebbles, but nothing like the huge ones Professor Jake called mountains. The year of the last day without clouds was recorded in the professor's book, which he had written from his childhood memory 30 years after the event. He said there would be a sound like deep, angry drums reverberating through the sky. David wanted to believe that the old man was telling the truth, not only about the future, but also about the past. He was skeptical, though. This was his nature. His mother, who had rust-colored hair like David's and laughed too hard and cried too often, asked him sometimes, "Why can't you just believe? Is it so hard?" It was hard, and he couldn't explain it to her. She believed everything. David wanted to believe, but he knew that old people sometimes remember things that never happened and forget things that did. He was a smart boy, and he was a reader, as most smart boys are. He had read all about the day of no clouds. He had read the old man's book 3 times. He wasn't sure his mother had read it even once. She didn't seem to need books to help her believe in something. He realized, though he didn't tell her this, that he was smarter than she was. One morning, the clouds started weeping. These were not typical mists, but drops, and then strings, and finally slanting whips of water. They lashed the earth and fell so hard that David wondered if his face was bleeding. Of course he continued looking straight up into the sky, even though it hurt. Then, as abruptly as the clouds had shed water, there were bursts of brilliant electrical light exploding within one cloud and then bouncing to another. The light danced. Almost immediately there was, yes, drumming. It was deeper and louder than anything David had ever heard, and it did sound angry. It made the earth shudder. Most of the citizens ran into their houses terrified. Some took refuge in the mines. David, as you might guess, stayed outside and watched. It was glorious and wet. The old man's book had predicted the sounds, though it had said nothing about the dancing light. David thought it strange that the professor would have omitted such an important detail. Still, if the book was right, the clouds would lift soon. That was when David did the most courageous thing of his young life. He went to Professor Jake's house. He knew where it was, of course. Everyone did, though few ventured there. The old man was considered a prophet and a sage, and perhaps even eternal. Few dared approach so great a man. Did he keep servants? David thought he probably did, for, as everyone knew, the old man was wealthy. He had gold, which was the center of the city's economy. Most of the citizens mined either gold or coal. Most spent their days underground. The old man said in his book that the huge rocks were like the mines, but upside down. They were as tall as the mines were deep. David couldn't picture that, but he wanted it to be true. He took a deep breath as another rumbling drum sounded, and then he began his journey to the biggest house of Nebula. He walked up the ancient city road and hiked the winding path to the old man's mansion. The path stones were laced with little ferns and a few wild berries. The clouds were still playing with light. The drums were still clamoring, but softer now. The water had slowed to a drizzle. David approached the door, which was twice as big as he was, and black. Again he drew a deep breath, waited, and finally knocked, but only once. It sounded weak and hollow, and the door was thick. How could anyone hear him? He turned his head to get one more look at the lights. Something had changed. There were no more drum sounds, no more strings of water, and the light was different. That was when he saw a sight he would never forget. A band of many colors was stretching up into the heavens. These were colors he had never beheld. He didn't even know what he could compare them to. Some were light shades of Nebula's few flowers, golds, greens, blues, and pinks. Others were colors he had never seen. They were all pale yet bright. How could something be pale and bright? And they glittered. Why was there no mention of this in the professor's book? He stared, memorizing every detail. The colors were stretching further. Then David realized that another color band was forming from the opposite side of the sky. He shook his head in wonder. Oh, the colors! He counted 6, but didn't know what to call them. The display was only temporary, though he willed them to linger. The colors faded as he watched. Again, David faced the door and knocked. 3 times this time, as hard as he could. He glanced behind him to see one last trace of the ark. It was gone. He could hear steps. They stopped just inches away, right behind the door. The knob moved, and the door opened, just an inch at first, and then fully. The old man stood before him, bent and wrinkled. He was, after all, more than 100 years old. His blue eyes were his most distinctive feature. They were just slivers between creased, saggy lids, but they were luminous, even joyful. Only a fraction of the population had blue eyes. David's eyes were slate gray, like the clouds on gloomy days. David liked blue eyes, especially the ones he was staring at, though he sensed he was staring too much and lowered his gaze. Then he noticed that the hems of the old man's trousers were frayed, and there were rips under his knees. David did a quick glance around him. All of the furniture was tattered. Why would a rich man live like this? Surely he could afford better. David lifted his eyes to the slivers of happy blue and swallowed. "Hello?" he managed. It took him 2 tries before he said the word loudly enough for anyone to hear. "Hello, David," the old man said. David's jaw dropped. He couldn't speak. Finally, he whispered in amazed, You know my name? Oh, yes. I know most people's names. I've had a lot of time to work on them. I remember when you were born. The clouds were slate that day. I've always liked slate days. It was beautiful. And you were a beautiful baby. I visited you. Did you know that I visit all the babies? I don't think anyone knows that. I do it during the early morning hours or sometimes late at night. I've been doing it for 10 years now. When the old man smiled, he looked far younger than he was. Why? David asked. You like that question, don't you? Why do I visit the babies? Because I know that you will see what I saw. I want to see the eyes which will behold great things. And I learned your names. Did you... He swallowed. He knew his next words might sound like an insult. Go on, David. Did you make any of it up? What you saw on the day of no clouds? No, none of it. Not any? Not any. Well, you didn't mention the lights in the clouds. Oh, my, did I leave those out? Pity. They're quite spectacular, aren't they? Why don't you come in, David? You're soaking wet, and I have a fire burning. Come sit with me. And the colors in the sky coming from both sides and making... Oh, a rainbow. Yes, I recall reading about that. I didn't see it myself. You can't see everything in one day. I've never read about a rainbow. No, probably not, said the professor. The account of the rainbow is one of the buried books. Long ago, you see, people thought the whole idea of a day with no clouds was a hoax. Most had lived their entire lives without seeing it. Naturally, they assumed it was all made up. Typical, isn't it? If we haven't seen it with our own eyes, well, you know, they buried the best books, and they shunned some who claimed they had seen the sights. My wife saw the day with no clouds when I did. We were children. But as she got older, she tried to tell everyone in Nebula what she had seen. Some called her crazy. Well, of course she quit talking about it. The professor winked. I knew she wasn't crazy, because I was her age, and I had seen it too. He gave a small laugh. We fell in love talking about the day with no clouds. It was our secret, and we learned where the old books were buried. We dug them up, one at a time, every week. We would sit together and read others' accounts. Oh, those were joyful times for us, holy times. We didn't realize it then, though. And when she died, giving birth to our son, he died too. I knew that I had to be courageous. I had to vindicate her. I had to let the secret out. So I wrote my book. It took me months trying to remember, revising it as I remembered better or when I wasn't sure I was remembering right. And when I published it, no one called me crazy, much to my delight. For some reason, by this time, the people wanted to believe. They even pretended that I was a rich scholar. People do that, you know, when they want to believe in someone. They treat them like royalty, like someone special. Actually, David, I'm a minor just like everyone else. I'm not even a professor. I'm a common man who happens to be very old. Not so common, said David. Please, said the old man, won't you come in? David entered the house. So, you saw the rainbow. Yes, answered David, but it didn't last long. Alas, so it is with many things. We get glimpses of glory, and then we're back to where we started. The peak moments pass quickly, don't they? What were the colors like? David raked his mind for words to describe them and finally shrugged. I can't explain. Amazing. Incredible. Sit down, won't you? David walked towards the nearest armchair, glancing around. There were paintings on the walls of big rocks in many hues. But you did see the lights back then, David said. Of course. I waited 30 years before I wrote it down, though. Perhaps I left out a detail or two, and perhaps I missed a few things. Well, I didn't see the rainbow, did I? Apparently I did miss at least one thing. David sat in the softest chair he had ever experienced. I don't want to miss anything. He sank into cushions so deep he was sure his knees were nearly up to his chin. Why are you inside your house? Don't you want to see the big rocks again? He asked. Oh, I may venture outside. I'm very old, you know. It's not easy. You're sure you saw them back then? Why would you doubt it? You've already seen things today which you never imagined. David squirmed, which was hard to do in that chair. I don't want to believe in something and then get disappointed. Ah, so that's how it is. Well, you will always find disappointment. See if you can be surprised by beauty instead. He stroked his long beard. Would you care for some tea? Cocoa? You must be cold. You're awfully wet, you know. I don't need anything to drink, said David. I want to be outside so I can see things. Of course. Yes, that's a good idea. There would probably be more books, but most of the people were frightened by the sounds. Oh, I should have given you the right word. Thunder. Yes, I should have mentioned that. The thunder frightened people. They weren't like you. They were scared to go outside. And as you might imagine, they didn't want to get wet. As I said, they weren't like you. So they missed it. And then they refused to believe in it. You didn't talk about the getting wet part in your book either. The old man didn't answer, but winked, and then helped him out of the soft cushions, walked him to the door, and bade him good-bye, saying, The water from the clouds is called rain. You're not coming with me? These old bones creak with every step, and I'm afraid my joints ache when it's wet. I'll step outside later. It's not so urgent for me. I have seen it, after all. On the day of no clouds, a century ago, and every evening when my wife and I read about it and remembered together. The truth is, I've had many days with no clouds. He winked and gave another smile. Goodbye, David. And he shut the door. Very soon, David noticed a new kind of light around him, streaming through the clouds in dazzling fans. Oh, yes, something was happening. The clouds were crisscrossing each other and pulling back. Something certainly was happening. Then he saw it, a shard of unclouded sky. But it wasn't pink, as the old man's book had claimed. It was blue as the professor's eyes. He was wrong, David said, and then remembered the words, Be surprised by beauty. The blue was beautiful, but the old man used that word too much. He described the clouds on David's birthday, and David himself with that word, beautiful. Surely there was a better one. The blue was like the old man's winking eye, strange and unexpected, and in this case, getting bigger. The blue was expanding as the clouds lifted. Now there was an endless belt of blue under the rising clouds. He squinted. Where were the huge rocks with the many-colored trees? He couldn't see them. The blue widened, and then, there, in the distance, oh, magnificent rocks, bigger even than what he had imagined. But the colors? No. None of the colors the old man had described was there. David started running towards the rock, the mountain it was called. He remembered that. Maybe if he got close, he would see the colors. He focused only on that possibility, though he was quickly aware that he was getting hot. He looked up, panting. The sky was a lighter blue now, and the clouds were almost all gone. Above him was a sight he had never read in any of the books. A globe, far brighter than anything he had seen dancing in the clouds. He could feel its heat, but could not look at the globe itself. Surely looking directly at it would burn his eyes. Why had the old man not mentioned this globe? He shut his eyes and forced himself to run on. He ran until his chest stung and his legs resisted one more step. Something in his left leg hurt. He limped as he continued, but he didn't stop. No, not once. Within a few hours, he had reached the mountain. It was even more enormous than he had thought, and its top rocks were covered in something like clouds, but different. The covering was white, and it glistened. But where were the colors? Everything about the trees and their leaves was drab, brown, gray, slate. There were no golds, no rusts, no reds. The dry, dangling leaves looked like desiccated moths. He touched one. It fell and swirled to the ground, and he saw that the ground was littered with them. The old man had made up the colors. Maybe in all those romantic moments with his wife, the two of them had added dreamy but false details to the reality. Maybe the colors in the man's book and the painting on his wall were more love than truth. Or maybe he wanted his book to sell more copies, and so he had lied. The globe was getting lower in the sky as David hiked the mountain. There were no trails, and he slipped many times, skinning his knees and elbows. It didn't matter. He would get to the top of the mountain and tell the complete truth. He would omit nothing. He climbed, scraping his arms on the pointed green trees whose branches jabbed and stabbed him. That didn't matter. It would be another detail of his true account. He climbed, finally removing his shirt in the heat. There were no unusual colors, no matter how high he hiked. David sat on a slab of rock and panted. The sky was changing. He looked towards the globe and found that it was no longer blinding. However, he could also see that the clouds were beginning to return. The globe was sinking into a sheet of clouds, illuminating them. Surrounding the globe were new colors. David took in a sharp breath as he realized that they, and most of the sky, were exactly the color of strawberry meat, just as the old man had described. He watched the sun sink. The sky was growing dark. He hiked higher, higher, higher. Then directly above him, but far too high for him to even imagine touching, there was a pinprick of light. A few moments later another appeared, and then another and another. The darker the sky got, the more these lights revealed themselves. It was as though the sky itself had little holes in it, and each hole let out a hint of the brightness behind it. How would he describe these lights? He began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He climbed to a higher peak. He was so tired, and he was a little angry that the old man had not mentioned these lights. 21, 22, 23, and higher yet. 180, 181, 182. The clouds were returning. There was no question of that. And David was exhausted. He would not get to the top of the mountain. He realized that now. Still he counted, more urgently because the clouds were gathering fast. 537, 538, 539. He had reached 2053 when the strings and puffs of clouds merged and blotted out the last of the lights. His eyes ached from finding each new light, which then became groups of lights, and then sprawling curtains of lights. He could see none of them now, and he wept. He was weak and worn out, but he walked down the mountain with considerably more trouble now, since the clouds were all around him. Sometimes he had to push them away so he could see his next step. The journey down took him hours and included many falls, but finally he was on the ground and made his way, still limping and bruised, to the professor's house. He raised his hand, oh, it was heavy, made a fist, and pushed himself against the door. It took all of his strength to knock. The professor answered quickly, as though he had been waiting. "Hello, David," he said. David blurted an accusation. "You didn't say anything about the lights in the sky." "Stars. They're called stars." "You didn't write about them." "No, I didn't. There are so many." But you saw them?" "Oh, yes. My wife and I, we both did." I tried counting them. I wanted to tell all about the day, and I didn't want to leave anything out like you did, but the clouds came back before—" "Please, won't you come inside and rest for a bit? You are so tired." "And you lied about the colors. The leaves, they weren't gold or rust or anything you said." "Ah, that's because I saw them in a different season. We each get our own day, and it's not the same as anyone else's. You saw the rainbow. I missed that. And I saw the leaves in their splendor. I'm afraid they had lost their color by the time it was your day. The colors don't last. Thus it is." He gave David an indulgent smile. "I can make you some cocoa. Would you like that?" "No, I want to go home." David's voice broke and his eyes filled again. The old man put his arms around him. "It was incredible, wasn't it, David? The day without clouds." "Yes," David whispered. "So much, so many, so vast." "Go home, my boy. Go home and rest." And that's what David did. He did write his own book about the day with no clouds, but not for many years. His book started simply, "David lived in a city of clouds."